So we're excited today, because we've been reading harder books. I mean, to read, obviously, I'm just not going to read all of 1st and 2nd Samuel, or I'm not going to read all of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It's just hard to get all that, and it's a hard narrative, right? Because you bounce around from genealogies, where our eyes glaze over,
Keep everybody straight.
Yeah. So I wanted to start out with that a little bit about the Amorites and the Amalekites, and because all these ites, as we were saying, you get confused, right? But it's important that we know who the bad guys are.
Amorite.
Okay.
Yes.
So my point is, you go even with Judges, which has more narrative in it. Again, it was hard to follow, and we pay attention to those stories in Judges where there's a lot of bloodshed. There's a lot of bloodshed. So now we moved into Esther. I don't know about you, but then you read it and there's a story there. You can actually follow the story. It's, you don't need a whole lot of insider information to be able to follow it at some level. But there are some interesting insider stuff going on here with Esther. So we're pretty excited about it. I really enjoyed reading it. And several people, somebody said they'd already read Esther, and wow, they really enjoyed it. So let's just impressions of Esther. I mean, is this a book you've known well, you've read before, you've studied? As you read it, those who did this week, any first impressions that you have of the book?
One of the things that I didn't know about, because Mordecai and Haman were really, and that's because one came from the Amorites and the other another, and they were always clashing.
Amalekite.
They're people,
Mordecai didn't
He's an
bow to.
Amalekite. He is not an Amorite.
Yeah.
So, and of course, they're all cousins. In the
I
Middle
know
East.
they
They're
are.
all, they're all from Noah, right? So they're all. But one, think of more southeast. That's Amalek. Children of Esau. So what do we know about Esau?
He was, God put a stain on him.
Esau.
Esau,
He was cheated out of his birthright.
right. He was
By
supposed to take
Jacob.
Jacob.
So in this, when the story is told, we kind of identify a little bit with Esau because he got cheated.
He did.
Jacob's this clever guy, right? Cheats him out of his birthright. Esau is then sent off, and he starts the Edomites. And there's always enmity. There's always problems between these two boys, these two brothers. So basically they split up and they hate each other forever. And remember, in the Bible, these are, if you have a grudge against your brother, that lasts like for 1,000 years. I mean, they don't forget.
Don't forget.
They just don't forget. So Esau goes and he's in the southeast. And guess who Moses runs into and Aaron as they're marching through the desert? Amalekites, Edomites. And who was the first group who didn't welcome Moses but fought him? The Amalekites. Of course, because they hate each other, And so the Bible keeps keeping, it's like having a low boil always on these tensions. And so you just have to wait until somebody turns up the heat. But it's always there, going all the way back to Genesis. You get these battles and they carry on forever. I mean, till today, right? I mean, it's just forever. So, so we just want to remember southeast Amalek. And how does he play a role in this story of Esther?
He's the villain. Haman.
Who was Haman? Yeah, he's the villain. Where was he from?
The other one.
No.
We just told.
He's an Amalek.
Oh, okay.
The Amorites were the original inhabitants of Canaan. All Aites. That's why I put it up there, because it's just so confusing. It just is. And I can't keep it straight. Sometimes I have to go back and say, what?
Who's who?
it was not only that, but I don't think Haman didn't like Mordecai because he didn't bow to him, because he expected everybody to bow.
Right.
And then he found out he was Jewish and he disliked him even more.
Right.
And he found it.
Let's get rid of them all.
Yeah, that's why they.
And that's part of the reason why I didn't bow. So we're gonna go,
Yeah.
but the text, as you saw, didn't explain that. It just says, well, because he was Jewish. You go, okay, what does that mean? Jews are not prohibited from bowing to.
Honor a person.
Mhm.
Right.
So why this time?
Maybe Haman had something, my one book said maybe Haman had a picture of an idol and that's why he didn't bow down. Good.
So everybody's guessing. It's not in the
Yeah.
Bible, but oh boy, all the other Jewish texts, the Midrash, they all have answers to that question, you know, and so we'll go into that a little bit. So again, the Amorites were the Canaanites, the original members of the land. It's in the southeast that you find the Amalekites. And again, they're from Esau, Edomites and Amalekites. So you can throw that out at a party sometime, you know, in the Bible trivia.
Yeah, there you go.
Jeopardy, here we come.
But the Bible, you know, we skip over some of this stuff, but when Haman is introduced into the text, how do they introduce him? Trying to find the exact verse.
It was high in the echelons of there. It's important. In chapter 3.
Where do they introduce him? Because they give you chapter 3. Somebody read that first one. And always when the Bible tells you, there's usually something going on there. And we pass over it because we don't pick up the cue, right? After these things, King, some think he was Xerxes, but here it's Ahasuerus, promoted Haman, son of,
Amadaphel,
I have no idea,
whatever.
the,
Agagite.
and there's your hint. Because Agagite,
Lord have mercy.
Wait, now we're in geology. Now we're in geology.
Now we know.
Part of
is an
that.
Amalekite. But you'd have to go all the way back, to, I think, 1 Samuel, you know, to be able to that. And of course, we don't do that. So, you know, we just go, oh, I don't care.
There's just
But-
too many kites.
Too many kites. Want to be like Ike.
Yeah.
But it's the key to him being a bad guy. Because once it says he's an Agagite, a Jewish reader would say, oh, he's a bad guy.
Yes.
All right. So we've got some of that when we watch the movies, right?
Yeah.
If you watch James Bond, you always know that James Bond's always written depending on who's the bad guy now, right? Is it a Russian? Is it a German? I mean, who are the bad
Right,
guys?
right.
You know,
Yeah.
Middle Eastern, you know, terror. 007 changes, but once they introduce somebody, you already know they're the bad guy because they're the bad guy in the press or whatever.
And the music tells you, the music changes when they show you the bag. Oh, that's him.
Yeah, so they don't introduce a nationality and then try to confuse you. The nationality is to point out, you know, like if he's Russian, oh, if he's Russian, he's the bad guy. We know, now, did anyone tell us that? We just know that, right? We're just reading our culture. We're just reading what's happening in the world. But 007 moves the enemy around depending on who the real enemies of the West are. So, you know, I think
China.
there was one of them, 007, where it was a Middle Eastern, it was kind of Gaddafi type of figure at that time, right? Or maybe a Syrian, you know, think, oh, terrorists. These are all generalizations. But that's what they're building their whole narrative on, is that we are buying into some of those narratives. And here it's Haman, the Agagite. Oh, he's a bad guy. Again, we wouldn't pick that up pretty quickly, unless a commentary told us that. Other things about the text, first of all, before we dive in, that
Yes.
I think it's amazing how Mordecai has Esther use her sexuality. I mean, she was to be, you know, just the very best, and
Get in the harem.
to get in the harem and so I cannot tell you how many times I have been invited to join Hadassah. And I thought sometime I should do it just for the fun of it.
So explain that.
Well, Hadassah is Esther in Hebrew, and I don't know why they think I'm Jewish. Edith is a very New York Jewish name, so I don't know, but I've never joined.
So, we're reading about the harem. Remind us again how that all worked with the harem. So Mordecai almost sounds like Ruth and Naomi, where Naomi say, okay,
Go slow.
here's what you need to do to attract boss, right? So you got a little bit of that, but this time it's on steroids, right?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Because you're gonna get into the harem, it's a beauty contest.
Right.
Right.
And a real, but where something's at stake, right? And so
Right.
Mordecai puts her in that position. And to prepare her for the contest, what do?
Give her beauty treatments for a year.
Here,
Not bad, right? Spa.
Spa all year long.
You know, it's like Christmas, if you got a spa treatment for
Oh,
a year,
good.
every day for a year.
Got even I look.
Perfume.
Even I don't even know.
But the one eunuch helped her, gave her some extra tips because he liked her.
So the text seems to say everybody liked her.
Yes.
So she's a little bit like Ruth. Again, remember how everybody liked Ruth
liked her.
because she had this wonderful character. And so here we've got, interestingly, that everybody likes her. Now, is she a morally upright person
No,
for the story?
neither one of
She's
them
a
were.
virgin. They said she's a virgin too.
Willing to be in a harem, that doesn't lift you up morally.
Eat unclean foods, all kinds of stuff.
So we've got this underlying story here of, are the Jews assimilating to Persian culture?
For a purpose.
They have
Yeah.
to. Yeah, there's a bigger goal.
For a bigger goal.
There's a big-
Yeah.
Being,
Save the Jewish.
Save the
people.
Jewish people.
well, now we're into Esther, really. But before she enters the contest, she's already assimilated.
She lives there, yeah.
Now Mordecai has and hasn't. Right? So let's just back up and review the story. The Babylonian exile, they all go in, they're treated not well. Now the Persians come in and defeat the Babylonians
Right.
and like the Jews.
Yep.
So now they're getting spread out all over the Middle East because you can go to Persia and live well. Just as they lived well in Egypt centuries before with Joseph. Remember?
Joseph, yeah.
Yeah.
So we've got almost a repeat story that they're treated well, they prosper until someone else comes in and now is threatened by this prosperous minority who have this weird religion, so they don't assimilate well. So part of this is Esther has assimilated, as have many of the Jews. She can hide it. The only reason she can hide it is because she's not really living like a Jew, probably in the harem, right? But Mordecai is. At least we know that he won't bow to the king's representative. So a little bit, we have to review the tradition here that when I'm the king, I have, the reason I can rule is because I have divine right to rule. I'm an image of the God. Even in Romans, I'm God, but I'm the image of God. Therefore, being divine, you have to bow to me. I've given the right to rule because that's what gods do. And God has given me the right as the king, divine right, the divine right of kings, which we have also in our Western tradition, to rule. But now I'm busy getting drunk all the time. Okay, the king doesn't come off very well here. You know, he's just always drunk and making bad decisions.
Yeah.
He's got a temper, right? And he'll just slaughter people, and you know that he doesn't come off well in the story. So he gives his rule to someone else, which now means he gives them his image. And that's why the text say maybe he wore an insignia that reflected that.
Yeah.
Some would have a ring saying, I'm working on behalf of the king, all right? I'm working on behalf of royalty. You still have that in our traditions in the West. And so if I were to bow to the king, then I also have to bow to his image. So in this case, his second in command. And Mordecai has a problem with that. It would have to be, if you take that interpretation, his rejection of idolatry. There has to be an idolatrous move that I would bow not to a king necessarily, but to one demanding royal approval, the image. By the way, this is such a powerful tradition in the Bible that you bow to the image of the king, you bow to the image of royalty. Once we understand that, we can see how radical Genesis is. Where God says, I make Adam and Eve in my
Image.
to do what? To rule. So it's in a sense, it's a democratization of the whole royalty thing. Now we're a royal piece. We are to rule, right? The fish of the air, the fish of the sea, birds of the air.
Dominion.
It's a radical statement where it says, let us make humankind in our image, male and female. That's what we used to talk about, male and female, but it's then to rule. This is one of the central themes, I think, of all scripture from Genesis all the way to the maps, is that God's rule. How does God rule? And here in Genesis, it's clear God rules through humanity, not just through the divine kings, but through all of humanity, because we're made in God's image. So we're now the image bearers of God. So you can't go around killing people. Yeah, there's human dignity, there's human worth. So I think this is a huge topic. It'll come up Sunday, where Jesus sends out his disciples, gives them marching orders, and what does he say? Tell people that the kingdom, the rule of God, has come near to you now. But usually the rule of God comes through humanity, and that's been the storyline so far. He tried through Adam and Eve, didn't work. And he tries through Noah, doesn't work. And he tries through Abraham and his family. It's struggling here, right? So the whole storyline is God keeps asking us to rule on God's behalf, and we don't do too well. So then how does God respond? It becomes really interesting, right? Adam and Eve, how did God respond? Kicks them out of the garden. Noah cleans the whole earth. Yikes. And then we've been following Israel, right? Through Abraham. So this idea of ruling is central. And here, for some reason, Mordecai is saying, I will not bow down and acknowledge the divine presence, the divine image of Haman.
Great. That also reminds me of the book of Daniel, where the three young men, Shadrach,
Right.
Meshach, and Abednego.
did not bow down to Nebuchadnezzar.
This is the same tradition. Now that's in Babylon, this is in Persia. It's the same storyline.
Mhm.
Will our Jews assimilate? Remember I told you the story a couple of weeks ago where I did that one Jewish wedding and
Yes.
they accused me of
Genocide.
genocide. That's the background of these texts, is that if you assimilate, we're going to lose our identity. And that had a religious identity to it, not just our Jewish identity, our religious identity as following God. And the Jews are all over now, Babylon, Persia, remember all these, that was the whole idea of sending people into exile, conquering their lands. They're to lose their roots. Because often my family tradition is rooted in the land. We all grew up here, and all my brothers and sisters are here. And we understand that here in the United States, because we move so much, you can lose your rootedness. In fact, some of us like to go home, and there's a home base somewhere, a farm, or where all the cousins live, or where my parents still live, right? That becomes home. And if you lose that, you kind of float a little bit. right? We've talked about that before. Does anyone have a home cemetery plot now where the family
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
buried?
Some of them.
Yeah, some of them are,
Yeah.
not me.
I bet it's a mixed experience here in the church, where some still have a place where they'd say, that's where, my parents, my grandparents were buried. And others would say, no, we've been just moving around and people are buried everywhere.
Well, if they're veterans, they're in the veterans, my parents are in a veteran cemetery in New York, in Pine Lawn. So, yeah,
Different groupings.
right, there's a lot of veterans.
So then not a family grave necessarily,
Right,
but sometimes military graves are, like you say, a different type of bondedness.
We have one in Pennsylvania that some of my older relatives are, and I managed to get Jaden there just to show him the insignia for the Civil War, because my great grandfather was in the Civil War. And I wanted him to see it's, it's still clearly marked on the grave that he was a Civil War veteran.
So you're trying to instill family legacy, and that's when we had these exile traditions, the idea of a conquering power was to destroy all that.
Yeah.
If I can destroy your rootedness, in fact, if I can destroy your temple and your religion,
Right.
now I can better,
And
you become more pliant to whatever it is I want. Jews have been brought all over the Middle East at this time. And so you have them in Babylon, and remember, a lot of them stayed in Babylon because they had assimilated. And now we know the majority stayed in Persia because they liked Cyrus, they liked the treatment they got. And so in that environment, what's behind the text, are they losing their way religiously? Are they losing their identity religiously? And so here Mordecai comes off pretty well, I think, in this story. He's standing up for something. Even better than Esther in some, as far as a moral character, I would say. We'll find out how we feel about it. But she's the heroine of the story, obviously. But Mordecai's not far behind on that one, because he's kind of behind the scenes doing all the right stuff.
But God is further behind the scenes.
Yes, yes.
Well, say something about that, because as we know, God is never mentioned in this whole book.
Right.
So you gotta, what's this book doing in the Bible? God doesn't, does God play a role even though God's not mentioned?
You see him at
Yes,
work.
definitely, definitely.
Like
The right people at the right time, in the right place. Yep.
So you get that sense, and you'll hear that in a second, that God is behind the scenes directing traffic. Here's a book where providence plays this massive role. And I think Mordecai says it best when he says, maybe just for a time as this.
Yes.
And that's often quoted when
Yeah,
people
yeah,
just
yeah.
end up at the right time, at the right place. They go, but I wouldn't have planned it this way, but now, but for a time like this, I've been put in this position. So it's a very powerful, and of course, God's all over that sentence. Did God place Esther? And of course, Mordecai suggesting, yeah,
Yes.
And right from the get-go, God made Esther so beautiful, so, I mean, she could have been homely as a mud fence and it wouldn't have worked.
That's right. Yeah.
I haven't heard that phrase before.
Homely as a mud fence.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah,
I
that's
guess.
all.
I heard that.
Before we show the tape again, how did people feel about Vashti?
I think she was right in doing what she did.
Yeah.
Say more about that.
Well, she was beautiful, and she said, I don't want to be thrown in front of a bunch of drunk guys and show off,
Googling me.
my beauty or whatever. But
Googling me.
Google.
I think that's exactly the story. She's just saying, I don't want, he's drunk.
Yeah.
Remember, like 180 days, they've been drinking.
Oh, yeah, the celebration.
And that's a religious festival as well, which we know.
That was a long
That's
one.
quite
But we know religious festivals
They got the Pollock speed.
had a different character, we've run into this before, 180 days of not just drinking, probably.
Feasting.
You bring it in the temple prostitutes and, it's quite a quite a party. And she wants, obviously, no part of it. I'm not gonna sit out there and
No,
dance for
no
your drunk
respect.
friends, right?
Right.
So give me some respect. What's the response by the king's royal advisors?
Oh, you better take care of that because all the women are gonna be doing that in their households.
That's why he said all men were head of their households, right?
Right.
Yeah.
By royal decree.
Straight, yeah.
Now, if
She
you
was
need a
banished.
royal decree to make that happen,
Yeah.
you probably lost, the train has probably left the
And
station.
he banished her from the palace too, didn't he?
What?
She was banished from the palace as well,
She's banished.
From his presence.
from his presence.
Yeah.
He didn't execute her or anything. Just
No, no.
banished her. Yeah, yeah.
So again, he doesn't come off as being a real person of character,
Right.
a family man.
But he treated
A regular
Esther
Peter
nicely.
Okay, so now the drunk, violent king falls in love with our heroine, Esther. She gets 1 year of spa treatment, but that was not just spa treatment. Okay, she had attendance, she was given an education on royal policy, on manners, on how to treat the king, how to enter, how to, not just occur, but all mannerisms that you'd want from a queen. So you're now, who do we have that from? Harry's, or even Lady D, when she falls in love with Prince Charles, right? She's got to be educated into
Right.
all the royal
Right.
stuff, because there's just so much going. So it's not just a beauty treatment.
Right.
There's a whole enculturation into what does it mean to be a queen. And we get that later in the story because Mordecai says, you got to go and talk to the king. And she said, that's not the way it works.
No,
He has to request my presence.
right.
And until he requests my presence, I'm putting my life, because you can figure if he had several hundred women in his harem and they're all wanting audiences, it'd be chaotic. And so he has to request, he's completely in control of his harem. And she knows that, she knows the protocols. And even though he knows does it say love? Does it say love or what's the word? I can't remember now. What's his relationship with her? Do we
He
remember?
favors her.
Favor. I think it was more the favor language than the love language.
But when he sees her in the doorway, he extends the scepter to her that she's welcome.
But she has put her life, it's
Yes.
very clear in the text, she's put her life, she's breaking protocol. And she knows, she said, okay,
Do or die. This is.
yeah, that's right, it's do or die, literally. We say that do or die, but here in Esther, it's, she's really putting her life on the line for her people.
I think those are two really important themes that we see is favor of God over Esther's life, but also divine providence. And we see three women who have favor of God. And so it's not so much about morality or lack thereof, but God's plan for his people and eventually bringing Jesus through the line of his people. So we see in Rebecca, we see that she lied to get Jacob's blessing. She lied to her own husband and betrayed her own son.
Right.
That's not a lack of morality. That's being outside of the law because God is an outlaw God. We also
But it
see
is
that-
outside of morality.
It is.
but God works that way. And that's what we need to see. That Esther, the same thing, right? A harem, but she was actually moving in God's divine will. And then Ruth at the feet of Boaz, because it was the plan of God to bring about really Jesus into the world. And so we see all these things that are happening because God is behind the scenes always, from Genesis to Revelation, bringing his divine will, breaking the law that we so desperately want to hold on to, and showing us that he is God all along, favoring his.
Okay, I think this is a very important point, and then we'll watch the tape. If you read Deuteronomy, you might think that God can, in fact, if you visit a lot of churches in Naples, you might think that God can only work God's favor in a morally pure context. Right? In other words, if you're not following God's law perfectly, don't expect God's favor. Don't expect God's blessing, right? So I got to get on God's good side. I got to be obedient. Here, I think you're exactly right. It's a morally fraught situation. This is not even Esther, she has all these people impaled. She has everybody killed. I mean, she's got blood on her hands as well, right? She's been part of a harem. She's married a Gentile, or she's, whatever they were.
Pagan.
Pagan, which you're not supposed to do. That is rejected in the Old Testament. So she's not, it's a morally muddy situation. And yet we say God is still working God's will in, just like Abraham. Remember, he goes to Egypt and hands over his wife to the Pharaoh. Not morally very good. And so we see this theme constantly, I think. And here we see it in Esther. We're in a morally complex, but not just complex, muddied, compromised world. God still acts. Because sometimes we can get cynical and say, well, it's all so bad. I don't see what God could do in such a mess, right? We first have to get our act together. We first have to become holy people. We first have to, which kind of Deuteronomy says over and over again. And here, Esther, no, God works in amazing ways. Okay, let's run the tape. Thanks for everybody joining us online. We're going to run the tape now. And we're having a training session with Beatrice, who's learning how to do this. So we have redundancies here. So just give us a second while we, by the way, while they're figuring this out, congratulations to Beatrice. She was in the Nautical worship service last weekend, which was great. She played actually a great role next to the bishop, praying in both Spanish and English, and was kind of recognized. I think that surprised people. So you can start. I'm just trying to fill the gap here.
Okay.
And we're good.
And she did a good job too.
Again, thank you.
The book of Esther, it's one of the more exciting and curious books in the Bible. The story is set over 100 years after the Babylonian exile of the Israelites from their land. And while some Jews did return to Jerusalem, remember Ezra and Nehemiah, many did not. And so the book of Esther is about a Jewish community living in Susa, the capital city of the ancient Persian Empire. And the main characters in this story are two Jews, Mordecai and then his niece Esther. And then there's the king of Persia, who's something of a drunken pushover in this story. And then there's the Persian official Haman, the cunning villain. Now, this is a curious book in the Bible, mainly for the fact that God is never even mentioned, not once, which might strike you as kind of odd. I mean, isn't the Bible about God? But this is a brilliant technique by the author, who's anonymous, by the way. It's an invitation to read this story looking for God's activity, and there are signs of it everywhere. The story is full of very odd, quote, coincidences and ironic reversals, and it all forces you to see God's purpose at work, but behind the scenes. Let's just dive into the story. The book opens with the king of Persia throwing two elaborate banquet feasts that last a total of 187 days. And it's all for the grandiose purpose of displaying his greatness and splendor. On the last day of the banquet feast, he's really drunk, and he demands that his wife, Queen Vashti, appear at the party to show off her beauty. She refuses, and so in a drunken rage, the king deposes Vashti and makes this silly decree that all Persian men should now be the masters of their own homes. Then he holds a beauty pageant because he wants to find a new queen. This is like a really bad soap opera. But it's right here that we're introduced to Esther and Mordecai. Esther hides her Jewish identity and enters the beauty pageant and wins. And the king is so obsessed with Esther that he elevates her to become the new queen of Persia. Now, after this, and even more serendipitous, is the fact that Mordecai just happens to overhear two royal guards plotting to murder the king. And so he informs Esther, who in turn informs the king, and Mordecai gets credit for saving the king's life. Now, right here from the beginning, God's not mentioned anywhere, but this all seems providentially ordered. What is it that God's up to? You have to keep reading. We're next introduced to Haman, who's not actually a Persian. He's called an Agagite. He's a descendant of the ancient Canaanites. Remember 1 Samuel chapter 15. The king elevates Haman to the highest position in the kingdom, and he demands that everybody kneel before Haman. Well, when Mordecai sees Haman, he refuses to kneel, which of course fills Haman with rage. And when he finds out that Mordecai's Jewish, Haman successfully persuades the king to enact this crazy decree to destroy all of the Jewish people. And to decide the date of the Jews' annihilation, Haman rolls the dice. A die is called pur in Hebrew. Tuck that away for later. 11 months later, on the 13th of Adar, all the Jews will die. Haman and the king then have a drinking banquet to celebrate their really horrible decision. So the focus now turns to Mordecai and Esther, who are the only hope for the Jewish people. They make a plan that Esther is going to reveal her Jewish identity to the king and ask him to reverse the decree. But approaching the king without a royal request is, according to Persian law, an act worthy of death. So in a key statement, Mordecai, he's confident that even if Esther remains silent, that deliverance for the Jews will arrive from another place. And then Mordecai wonders aloud. He says, who knows? Maybe you've become queen for this very moment. Esther responds with bravery, and she purposes to go to the king with her amazing words, if I perish, I perish. Now, in what unfolds, we watch the ironic reversal of all of Haman's evil plans. So Esther hosts the king and Haman at a first banquet, and she says that she wants to make a special request of both of them at an exclusive banquet the following day. So Haman leaves the banquet totally drunk, and he sees Mordecai in the street. He fumes with anger, and he orders that a tall stake be built so that Mordecai can be impaled upon it in the morning. It seems like things can't get any worse for the Jews and for Mordecai. But all of a sudden, the story pivots. It just so happens that night, the king, he can't sleep. And he has the royal chronicles read to him for good bedtime reading. And he just happens to hear about how Mordecai had saved the king's life. He had totally forgotten. So in the morning, Haman enters to request Mordecai's execution. And the king in that moment orders Haman to honor Mordecai publicly for saving his life. So now Haman has to lead Mordecai around the city on a royal horse, telling everyone to praise him. Now this moment in the story, it's a pivot for the whole book. It begins Haman's downfall and Mordecai's rise to power. Watch how this works. The day after is Esther's second banquet. So the king and Haman arrive, and Esther informs the king that first of all, she's Jewish, and second, that Haman has enacted a decree to murder her and to murder Mordecai, who saved his life, and to murder all of the Jews. Now the king's had a lot to drink, so when he hears this news, he goes into yet one more drunken rage, and he orders that Haman be impaled on the very stake he made for Mordecai. It's ironic and a grisly way for Haman to go. Haman's execution, however, doesn't solve the problem of the decree to kill all of the Jews. So the focus now turns to Esther and Mordecai as they make a plan to reverse the decree. They discover that the king can't revoke a decree that he's already made. So instead, the king commissions Mordecai to issue a counter-decree. On the appointed day that all of the Jews were supposed to be killed, the 13th of Adar, now the Jews are ordered to defend themselves and to destroy any who plotted to kill them. Then Mordecai, Esther, and Jews everywhere hold banquets and feasts to celebrate this new decree, and Mordecai is elevated to a seat beside the king. Eventually, the decreed day comes, and the Jews triumph over their enemies. First, they destroy Haman's family, and then any other Persian officials who had joined in Haman's plot. And then on a second day, they get permission to destroy any who plotted against them throughout the entire kingdom. This results in joy and celebration as the Jews are rescued from annihilation. The story then tells about how Esther and Mordecai established by decree this annual 2-day feast of Purim to commemorate their deliverance from destruction. And the name of the feast comes from Haman's dice. Remember, Purim. The book concludes with a short epilogue as Mordecai is elevated to second in command in the kingdom, and we are told now of his royal greatness and splendor as the Jews thrive in exile. Now, step back. Notice how this whole story has been designed. The story was full of moments of ironic reversal, but we can now see the whole story is structured as an ironic reversal. right down to the details. So the king's splendor and feasts and decrees are mirrored by Mordecai's splendor and feasts and decrees at the end. Esther and Mordecai, they first saved the king, but now in the end they save all of the Jews. Then you have Haman's elevation and edicts and banquet that gets reversed by Mordecai's elevation and edict and banquet. And then at the center you have Esther and Mordecai's planning scenes, and then Esther's two banquets that act as a frame around the greatest moment of reversal in the whole story: Haman's humiliation and Mordecai's exaltation. Beautiful. Another fascinating feature of this book is the moral ambiguity of the characters. There's a lot of drinking and anger and sex and murder, of which Mordecai and Esther are a part. Not to mention their violation of many commands in the Torah, like marrying Gentiles or eating impure foods. And so the story's not putting Mordecai and Esther forward as moral examples, as if it endorses all of their behavior. But they are put forward as models of trust and hope when things get really bad. And so the book of Esther comes back to that question with which we began: why God is not mentioned. The message of this book seems to be that when God seems absent, when his people are in exile, when they're unfaithful to the Torah, does this mean that God is done with Israel? Has God abandoned his promises? And the book of Esther says no. It invites us to see that God can and does work in the real mess and moral ambiguity of human history. And he uses the faithfulness of even morally compromised people to accomplish his purposes. And so the book of Esther asks us to be willing to trust God's providence even when we can't see it working, and to hope that no matter how bad things get, God is committed to redeeming his world. And that's what the book of Esther is all about.
In 7 minutes. 8 minutes.
All right.
Mhm.
Okay, reactions. To what we
They
just
did a
saw.
Great job.
Yes.
That was very well done.
Karma.
Karma.
Karma. Yeah.
When Haman first goes to the king, he doesn't say to kill all the Jews. He just says there are people out there that don't want to obey your rules and laws. He doesn't name the Jews.
Did you look in, does he mention the Jew? That's what he's referring to,
Right.
obviously. And remember, he's going to pay the king for the right to
A
do
lot
this.
of money.
He's gonna pay him a lot of money. So the king's probably thinking, okay, if there are bad people out there, yeah, you can take them out, all of them, you're gonna pay me all this money, that's good. So again, the king comes off as pretty superficial as a drunken, violent person who only likes his wives if they will come and do what he commands them to do in public. Again, he does not come off well anywhere in the story, really.
With the
I
exception.
look at that, but the story, I think, is told that there is a large anti-Semitic sort of a universal feeling, because these decrees are going out. There were 127 countries under the Persian rule, 127 that went from Afghanistan all the way down to India and circled around Ethiopia. We're talking about huge empire.
That's right.
First, the Babylonians conquer all that, and the Persians conquer, and they get all those 127. So they send out writers with this decree
Right, take
that
the-
everyone can take out the Jews. So this is the Holocaust on steroids, because it's not just in Germany, it's 127. So there is the feeling, I think, that the Jewish group who are in the 127 counties, so the Jews are everywhere, are this minority who are successful, who have now this problem of this anti-Semitic feeling everywhere, because otherwise the decrees wouldn't make sense, right?
But the king had one saving grace, his gratitude for his life being saved. And how did that happen? God put that into his head and into his dream.
Well, right, he had he can't sleep, so he has the history of his empire read to him, which he was supposed to put him to sleep, I guess. It's like reading a history book at night, you know, I don't know what you read to put you to sleep, but you know, sometimes you can also read Chronicles. The first Chronicles, that'll put you to sleep. And obviously here's then the story again about Mordecai, which again, this providence keeps, what are the chances that, you know, that would be what you'd even hear or remember before you fell asleep?
This anti-Semitism never stops.
No.
No.
Never stops.
It's here today.
Right,
Right
It's
here.
rampant.
It's even stronger than ever.
Now it's spread to Christians big time.
So there was a curse put on the Jews thousands and thousands of years ago then. A curse or something, why?
No, I don't
Is
think,
this
not a curse
Not
necessarily,
a curse,
but
but
there
there's
are,
evil spirits there to wanna, get rid of all or kill all of the Jewish people. There had to be
So I
an
think-
evil spirit there.
the way the
God's
Bible
chosen people
unfolds the
like
story
Muslims.
is, once they lost their homeland, Israel, Judah. Now you go other places, and anytime you go other places as a minority, it's not gonna be pretty. I don't care who you are, whatever minority, but this is then the Jewish existence everywhere. So now they're the minority in Persia, they're a minority in Babylon. They're even the minority in Israel, really, even in the biblical times, because you have the Samaritans, which are the largest population, and then you have the Romans, right? And part of it was you're a minority, but the part of it is that you have a definite religious tradition that's opposed to idolatry. So I can't bow to the Caesar.
Right.
I'm just not in any sort of religious way. I won't do that. I won't assimilate. So a lot of other people's say, well, yeah, I was worshiping Baal, but now, okay, I'll worship Caesar. Doesn't bother me. But for faithful Jews, that was forbidden. And you had a mark, an exterior mark for males that said, I'm a Jew. And we know in the biblical times, you couldn't hide that. Right, you couldn't hide it because all the boys at school would wrestle, and you always wrestled in the nude.
Naked.
You always wrestled naked.
Freaks, yeah.
So parents are always asking at that time, like with your book, The Maccabee, do we have our boys circumcised? Because once we do that when they're 8 days old,
That's it.
that marks them forever publicly. They can't hide, not like Esther, who could hide, obviously, but a boy couldn't hide. So that becomes, will we be faithful as a people? Will we be faithful as a family? Will we have our boys circumcised? What will that mean for them? How do we teach them? All that stuff is just really powerful here. So it's not, it was a religious tradition. And that's why Esther, the book, is there to say, oh, even as much as she assimilated, in the end, she stands up for her people. Even though she's eating their food, she's marrying their men, so to speak, the king, she stands up and saves the people. So it's a pretty strong story.
Yes, great.
Very powerful.
And I think one of the things too about what was mentioned about why the Jews have been persecuted since the beginning, I think it has to do with two things. First, they were God's chosen people. So immediately they have a target. It's just like when we're baptized, now we become God's chosen people as well. So we have a target as well. We and the other thing is their idolatry or rebellion would then bring punishment upon them. So then they were God would allow them to be in the hands of their enemies too. So that's why I think those two things, and the devil, yes, of course, has to do with that, because he wants to destroy them, because that's his way of getting back at God. Because he can't touch God's, but he can touch his
You can destroy
creation.
the chosen.
Yeah, exactly.
It kind of reminds you of Fiddler on the Roof. What was the famous,
Yes.
if we're God's chosen, do you choose somebody else? You know,
Right.
I can't remember exactly how that. Any questions before we go into our groups from the story?
Why did Queen Esther have two feasts? The second one, she tells the king about.
Because she knows exactly what
Softening them
she's
up.
doing to set up Haman.
Mhm.
So She doesn't go right after it, just
Right.
barge into the king's presence and say, you got this guy who's killing the Jews, and by the way, I'm a Jew. She could have said that, but she's setting him up publicly, because remember, each time at the banquet, she's honoring Haman and the king,
Right.
and what does he promise each time?
Up to half of the kingdom.
Up to, I'm so pleased with you.
Yeah.
So she has put now herself in a strong position to negotiate. So this is her smarts of those 12 months of training.
Yeah.
And her own smarts, her own sense of, I'm gonna put the king in a position now where he commits to me publicly
Right.
in the presence of Haman, who he thinks he's going and being recognized.
Right.
She just turns the whole event around. You can imagine how dramatic that second banquet.
And leading the horse with Mordecai.
Leading the horse with Mordecai. I mean, it's just a classic right there. Okay. All right, let's just get into groups, just for like 10 minutes. And what you're doing in the groups is, what do you pull out of the story now? What do you hold on to from the story of Esther? Really, either as a driving question, but more importantly, your takeaway, the insight from the text. Okay, and same way for you online, we're gonna put you in a group. I hope you'll stay, and we'll get back together in about 10 minutes. Yep.
You want to go join them? You want a bigger group?
I don't know. Way to go.
I guess
That's everything.
That's cool.
Around. And you can take a picture of Esther, but each of them are there, which is kind of nice, because sometimes you can just take a picture of it. We'll try to bring it every Thursday, so, you can have a cup of coffee and just don't touch the chocolate donuts. before you- Now, here's what struck me. I'd be anxious to get your response. But the women play, again, I would say again, a pretty interesting and leadership role in this book. And we saw that already with Ruth,
Yes.
and it was Ruth and Naomi, right? But here we've got it again. And I'm struck because in Exodus, the woman's leadership role is hidden. Remember Miriam? Miriam is
Yes.
obviously a leader with Moses, with her other siblings, Moses and Aaron. But as the story goes on, Moses rises and Miriam is put down, even punished because she's not supporting her brother. We don't have that here. We have both Esther, but we also have Vashti. It's very interesting. She comes off really well. I think you're right. I'm not your performing monkey.
Right.
Just not, you're just a drunken mess, and your friends don't respect them.
Right.
And it's interesting, then the friends, advisors say, if you let this go, we got trouble.
All the women will do it.
Because we're all drunk and all, we're all not the moral leaders of the community. And maybe then our wives will demand that of us. I mean, it's quite the story of Vashti. And she didn't back off. She didn't say, oh, okay, I'll go out there and do my ballroom dance, or whatever they were asking her to do. So Vashti really has some integrity here.
Yeah, enough to give up her second position, best queen.
And she gives it up. Yeah. And then you have Esther come in. Now Mordecai's there. I think Mordecai comes off the best in the story, but she comes off, she puts her life on the line. He didn't have to do that. It was just on the line. I went back and it was clear this was an anti-Semitic action. So So it was clear, even though he's kind of fluffing it up at the beginning, and we got this group, right? He
Yeah.
gets the king to,
To make it degree.
but it's clear. And then they had the banquet, remember, even to celebrate their agreement. Wow. But the king would do that because he's gonna get a lot of money. And he's gonna take out his enemies who he's now hearing, perceiving as enemies.
Right.
So again, very interesting that often the Bible is described as kind of male oriented, and it is. But here you got some incredible stories that are really quite powerful.
When we talk about God being in the background, all these stories that we've talked about, the women are, or the men are in the foreground, but it's the women behind the women. So maybe we don't have to be.
Except
So-
except with Esther, she's right out there in front. on this
Yeah.
one. She's driving the bus on this one. And she asked Mordecai at the beginning for instruction, right? How to get in the harem and. But this plan, even though Mordecai's probably, she's really the leader. She knows the palace intrigue. She knows the policy. She knows how to approach the king and get things accomplished, so to speak. Now, it's also interesting, I think, that the king, let's call him Xerxes here. I think that's who he was. Can't rescind an order that he's already given in his name.
Had to make a new decree.
Had to make a new decision.
The Jews were allowed.
Interesting, yeah.
the Jews
Isn't
were
that
allowed to
interesting?
protect
I thought so too. Why not just,
Do we see that anywhere else, that kind of thing?
have just Persian, it just says Persian law. It doesn't give us any other explanations, you know? You got
I'm
that,
just trying to think through history too. We know lots of examples of decrees, but then they get changed.
He's omnipotent, you would think, yes, if he's all powerful, then he should be able to reverse his
Yeah,
own,
he's-
right?
yeah, right.
some would say, for example, when the Pope came out and speaks ex cathedra,
Uh-huh.
right? Then he's speaking for God. And then if he can't then, a couple of years later, say, oops, you know, because it would undermine the whole divine power of the statement, right? Now, the Pope has only spoken that way a couple times, right? Ex cathedra. But once you've said that, I'm speaking for God, then you can't again go back a couple years later, and go, "Whoa," you know.
In the movie.
Now, you did find that with the Mormons, remember, on Black Americans, where they finally rescinded the prophets. Yeah, so that's interesting. But you don't hear it a whole lot.
Next week.
So
Okay.
I think he's worried to undermine his own authority. He can't keep saying
Yeah,
oops,
that makes sense.
and so.
Yeah, because they were still gonna come after the Jewish people, but they were allowed, the new amendment allowed them to protect themselves.
Right.
And I read somewhere there was like 75,000 people that actually died in the book of,
Jews killed 75,000
yeah,
and all of Haman's boys.
right.
And on.
And Mordecai got Haman's house.
And that this is all of it.
Yeah,
So he
so
did get spoils.
We can see.
They were supposed to take the people out without taking the spoils.
that's interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that. How do you read that? Because it's repeated several times that they didn't take the spoils. So
They did
so
not.
there's retribution, there's death, but you couldn't tell the spoils, other than Mordecai, who receives Haman's house, right? Which is, I think, I consider that spoils.
Yeah,
But that's not how that's not how the text reads. It's almost as if there is divine justice, but no one's exploiting the killing of the enemies.
Right. They got their just desserts, as they say.
Yeah, and no more, and no more.
And no more.
Anything else come out of your conversations about the story of Esther?
I know the phrase for such a time as this has been one that's been taken out, but I like it.
Yeah. I think one of the things that we can take for us is that God's divine providence is always working behind the scenes, no matter if we see it or not, or even understand it, because it's so out there. And that when we focus on morality, we miss out on what God is doing. Because God works in mysterious ways, and that really is true. Yeah, yeah.
Sometimes you can only see it after the fact.
Yes.
And you can't see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we've also learned something about the story of the exile in this text. In that there were not that many Jews in exile in Babylon and then in Persia who came back to Jerusalem. I would say now, most scholars would say the majority stayed in Babylon and Persia. So there were, 3 waves of exiles coming back to Jerusalem to build. And remember, some of the Jews had never actually been taken into exile. They were still
They
in
stayed in
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem.
So you've got now Jews all over the Middle East with different stories to tell.
Yeah.
And some, remember, the exiles come back and they're going, what do you mean we can't help build the temple? We've been here the whole time. Where were you?
Yeah.
You exiles, right?
Yeah,
You
Right,
slaves,
right,
right? We stayed free people. And they were cut out, remember? Ezra and Nehemiah. You can't build the temple and you can't build the walls. Whew. That created animosity in Jerusalem. Remember, right? They have to protect the workers on the wall because everybody's mad in the surrounding villages. So you've got that internal conflict with those coming back. But obviously there's a feeling, how did the Jews who came back to Jerusalem feel about those who stayed back in Persia and Babylon? And had, unlike Daniel, who had assimilated, right? Because the stories we get are those brave souls like Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. How do you spell those?
I don't know. I don't.
Those stories are probably told because the majority are assimilating. And so they want to lift up the minority, the brave, the faithful ones, like Daniel, and now like Esther, who claim their identity and loyalty. Here, she doesn't claim her loyalty to God,
No.
but to her people. Right?
Right.
And you can imagine what role this book played during World War II. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's huge, right?
Right.
So when the Jewish community would celebrate Purim, you know why? It was you don't know what God's up to. But we're going to hold we're going to hold on to God's providence.
And in preparation for the banquets, Esther didn't ask the people to pray. She asked them to fast,
So what religious background
meditation.
did she have? Or did Persians have? Does anyone know? They were Zoroastrian.
Oh, yeah.
So there's only about 500,000 Zoroastrians left in the world. There aren't that many.
Is that astrology? Is that what astrology?
Astrology plays a role. Yeah, but there's a commonality in a lot of religions, traditions, that God's will is built into the universe. So if I can read the universe, I can read God's will. So sometimes that boils down to, can I read the stars? Right? So even now you go to somebody along Bonita Beach Road and they'll read your stars because there's something about God's plan there. Or others say, no, it's not in the stars, just read the palm of your hand. Your history is built into nature again. When I would take students to Africa, they would kill a chicken and the entrails would fall out. And that order of the universe would be what you'd use to interpret someone's future. Or they had some sticks that they would throw on the ground, and depending on how the sticks landed, right? And remember, the Jews had some of that in biblical time, right? The priest would walk around with those dice in his outfit, right? What were those names? I always forget.
Pure?
The,
Or PUR?
PUR, and well, that means dice. There's 2 of them, and they would roll the holy dice and say, "What's God's will?" What's God's will? And I remember growing up where a lot of kids would do that. What's God's will, and they'd have to play Bible roulette. Where you'd open it up and
point to something. Oh, that's
read whatever God wanted to. I mean,
Sure.
not a great.
Yeah.
Well, I know.
Yeah, the holidays, like even the pagans threw what, the bones and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the idea is a similar one.
Yeah.
In that God is in the universe. Now, Interestingly, so in the stars, in some sort of natural realm. Interestingly, we have Zoroastrian priests in the New Testament who read the stars and find Jesus. The wise men. They're Zoroastrian kings who are who've learned to read the stars, and they say, "Oh, wait a minute, a king's been look, the king's been born."
That star.
You'll see the star there. So we're going to follow the star. What's amazing is they find Jesus. So you're going, "Ooh."
All trails lead to Jesus. All trails lead to-
I think that's what the New Testament's trying to say.
Yeah.
But even if you're Zoroastrian, and they would have known that because, of course, the Jews who did come back had been influenced by Zoroastrianism, and probably the biggest teaching was on Satan. So you remember Job, Satan is not our Satan. Satan is just an advisor to God, the royal courthouse, divine royal courthouse. But when they come back from Babylon and Persia, they've been indoctrinated into a real evil Satan, who's the Lord of darkness. And so a lot of the teachings about evil and the personification of evil through Satan was brought back from Persia.
So were they polytheism? They believe in more than one God?
Dualism, right? There's a kingdom of good and light, and there's a kingdom of bad and darkness, and they're at war with each other. And now you're in the midst of that war. How are you going to choose?
The stronger side, most likely, right?
So it plays out in the Western world, what we call Armenian holiness or Armenian Christians, which is a lot of evangelicals today, that they also view good and evil at war, and you're to choose good. You have a choice.
Well, you get choose good.
So choose this day whom you will serve, right? That you're in a morally neutral position, and the forces are out there, good and evil. They even read Psalms, where you have the two women who are crying to you in the streets, and you're this dumb little guy walking around, and he says, choose wisdom. But there's that other woman talking to you as well.
Yeah.
And don't
Oh, there.
go there. She might have the best tasting bread. Don't go there. And that's the idea, is that these two worlds are at war, and you're having to make a decision. Now, there's some truth to that, but usually we teach as Lutherans, you've already given in to the evil one. You already lost that battle. And now Jesus has to redeem you from that, right? But there's only one Lord, only one God. There's not an equal fight between the two. That's just not how we view the world in dualistic
But
terms.
wasn't that established in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve ate from the poison apple? Then they knew the good and the bad, and then that was the time that God came in and says, okay, now you have a choice, because you know both sides of that. So you have a choice, and all humanity from that day on had the spiritual battle between the good and the bad.
Yeah, there's a spiritual battle, but the
And
very
we're
battle
still in
itself
a
is a
spiritual
sign that you
battle.
lost. The battle itself, that we know good and evil,
Yeah.
was punishment for making the bad choice. So the knowledge of good and evil, I think,
Yeah.
the Bible would say, is a sign that we already lost.
Mhm.
Because the only reason we're in the battle is because we're not following God,
Right.
not good and evil. Now we're like God, and we're making our own judgments. So it's really fuzzy, and we always want that decision. But so you can see there's a lot of nuance there. But we would say God doesn't have an equal on the evil side. God is God.
He knows no evil.
God is above all things.
He knows no
And so there's not,
But he gave
however you describe Satan and the forces of evil, they are not God's equal.
Competition or,
And the world has already lost, right? Adam and Eve got kicked out of the garden, got kicked out of God's presence. So now the question is, how does God redeem us back out of the world of darkness, out of the Lord of this world being Satan? So, but you can see when you're, if you live in India you're going to be influenced by Hinduism.
Oh, sure.
If you live in the Middle East, you'll be influenced by whatever religions are there. Taking the positive, not buying everything, but taking the, and so Jews coming back from Persia have been very much influenced by Zoroastrianism. All right, anything else? Any other final?
Beautiful.
Esther is
Great.
a keeper, right? I mean, that's just such an interesting story.
Good stuff.
And I did like the way he mapped out all the turnarounds.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, the whole book is built on
Yeah.
these, I think, called ironic reversals,
Right, yeah.
which I think is really wonderful.
I had a friend in Columbus who thought that we as Christians should celebrate all of the Jewish holidays too. And I think it would be fun to celebrate for them.
We had a baby here one year.
So
Oh, yeah. I've been to see
here,
it.
just a quick response, because my parents were in that camp, you know, they were gonna celebrate every Jewish holiday. If there was a Jewish synagogue who thought all the Christian traditions were also Jewish because, you know, Jesus, so we're gonna celebrate communion. You go, wait a minute. That's not your tradition. So there's no way you could commune faithfully. So I think we want to be careful when we incorporate another religious community's celebrations. And I liked what a lot of, and your church did this too, is if a Jewish community, a synagogue invites you to participate, which many do now, that's, you're now participating in their
There.
festival and you get to participate instead of saying, I'm going to make my own Day of Atonement or let's, so, you know. So that's what most would do now is to say, we'd love to be invited to, you know, or sometimes churches will have it, but they'll have a local rabbi come.
Yes, we did.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So it's,
explaining.
but always honoring that's your tradition, but we'd like to be a part of it because we accept the scriptures too, and some of those traditions, just by honoring scripture, becomes somehow ours too in a distant sort of way.
I just like to honor it by saying I'm a second semester Jew.
There you go.
You know?
Yeah, like Paul, we're adopted.
When I was in high school, I had a Jewish girlfriend and they always invited me to their Seder and this Catholic couple.
Yeah.
To their Seder. It was very nice.
All right, let's end with a word of prayer. Good and gracious God, we thank you for Esther, for her witness to us about your faithfulness, even in the messiness of life. And we pray that you would give us a strong faith too, to hang on to you, even though we don't always see you at work, to celebrate indeed your faithfulness to us over the generations. Bless us now in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Next week, oh boy,
Job.
Oh, boy.
That's a good one.
come loaded for bear.
Oh, yeah. I'm out
Bye-bye,
on,
everybody.
Sable Palm Road, it's on 951.
All right, so I can head back up.
It's like a little farm out there. No crew, it was my dad and I for 30 years.
No, not right.
No, it's just me.